Afternoon is taken from the book of Matthew, chapter 12, verse 39 through 41. I'm reading from King James Version. But he answered and said unto them, An evil and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, and there shall no sign be given to it, but the sign of the prophet Jonas. For as Jonas was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh shall rise in judgment with this generation, and shall condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonas. And behold, a greater than Jonas is here. May the Lord bless the reading of his holy words.
I'd like another word of prayer, please. Dear Heavenly Father, may you penetrate my heart and penetrate our building and penetrate us all with your Spirit. We just want to show that to the world your Son's Spirit, your Son's character, and through us, and only in our actions and our words can this be done. Bless everybody here today. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Okay, I got the microphone on. I promised myself I wouldn't say that is the first word, but too bad it's not amen. I'll try to get in the habit. I'm going to have to ask for your indulgence. I come from a certain place and a certain time, and I'm a certain person. And the one thing I can promise you is when I'm up here today, I'm going to speak the absolute truth as best as I know it. I may make a mistake or misremember something, but I'm going to be as honest as I can. Mark Twain wrote a biography, and it wasn't supposed to be published 100 years until after he passed away, and thought he was safe in being honest. And he found it very difficult to bare his soul and to be honest, even though he knew that no one would be able to touch him about it after 100 years. My title is The Writer from Nowhere. Originally, I had a different title, and I kind of thought of this title, but I wanted to maybe convey something right away in case I didn't want to mislead anybody. What it was, it was, Shane, come back, Jesus, with an exclamation point, but it wouldn't quite fit, so I went with The Writer from Nowhere. And this was the original title to the story of Shane, and it was published in the late 40s in Argosy magazine in 3 parts. Later, a few years later, it became a movie with Alan Ladd. I guess Montgomery Clift was going to be the original guy, and I kind of imagined that, but I think there's some unique things about that actor in this time. It just came about, like certain events in my life, and too, because I'll seldom do a sermon, and you get really reflective, and maybe it's my age and what's going on in the world and in my life, and even I don't want to blame the pastor, but even hearing some of his sermons kind of started sparking things in me, and I feel this is where I was led. I was watching the movie Logan. I was with some family, and my nephew's wife and his 18-year-old daughter were there. He was still back in Kansas. And she had no clue about Marvel Comics, and maybe some of you don't. And And, I forget about that because it becomes second nature. You forget, you live in your own sphere of life and you forget what other people don't know or do know. And, to me it was common knowledge. I just even remember I grew up around here, even running, that was like kind of a aberration to people. Why are you running? Are you afraid of something? No, I'm running for my health, but it was, completely out of their context. But yeah, I was surprised. She's in her, well into her 30s, and she never heard of these things. And I thought, well, that's kind of a violent movie, even violent for me. And I'm thinking, well, how could you say that in church? Could you preface it even? And if you knew anything, or if you even heard, like I know Tiger Woods, and I know nothing about golf, but he's got these metal spikes coming out of his head. And I go, what place does someone being impaled by metal spikes has anything to do with the Bible? And then the natural thing occurred to me. I thought, well, the Bible is quite violent. And sometimes we tend to whitewash things and whitewash stories. And maybe sometimes that helps, that enables us to present a false character because we're used to whitewashing things. But some things are nitty gritty, especially true things, and the Bible's a true thing, and so there's you'll notice there's just a lot of admissions of guilt, a lot of admissions of immorality, and a lot of heartbrokenness, and a lot of terrible things happen in the story of the Bible. There I go again, but amen. But just try to hear amen every time I say I can hear my father correcting me. And it's another thing I have to think a lot about my father and my son. And it's going to be my son's birthday. You see him on the bulletin there. And another thing about Shane is that I named my son Jeremy Shane. In the Bible, you always name kids after great meetings, or at least what you hope their character would be. And Jeremy, this seems comical, and only my sister would understand, but I named him after Bobby Sherman. Because the character of Bobby Sherman, another Western. That's the thing too, I was like kind of on the cusp of the end of the great age of Westerns. And Westerns were still kind of a big deal. It was kind of fading, but they were very important. And Shane was after the gunfighter in the story. And because there was virtue there. So I seen the movie, and so I kind of got excited about it because here's a Marvel thing, and it's got Logan contained in it. And I thought the next day, because these movies are multi-billion-dollar things seen worldwide, and if someone's going to spend 5 or 10 minutes on a 1947 Western, or the movie's like just a few years later, if they're going to spend like 5 or 10 minutes talking about that in the middle of the context of their story. Because it's a big production, there's editing, they got to decide what to add, what not to add, how the story should go. And I thought that must have been a real big deal to them. And I think they had their reasons, but in my mind, I thought of it my own way. And I think that was true in the days that Shane was written, is that people are going into symbolism and the culture and literature big time, and they read things maybe that didn't belong there. And there's probably explanations for it. But it just occurred to me, and when I heard the pastor's sermon, that here's a way of, using fables. You're trying to talk to somebody in context of something they would understand. And, at work I always see kids, well, to me they're kids. I'm the old guy that's in charge of nothing over there. And I see the Captain America shirts. I see even the Wolverine shirts, which is Logan. And, and this is what I spent my youth on, reading. A lot of my first literature was comic books. And I thought, wow, I'm kind of a Shane expert in a sense, because I even named my son after him. I'll have something to communicate with him about, some kind of common ground. And, of course, I endeavored to. I talked to, because they're wearing their their superhero shirts. I think when I was a kid, I wouldn't have done that. I think when I was young, I think you still would get beat up for that. But now it's pretty common. And I think what it is, like I was always looking for, is you're looking for a hero. You're looking for solace in something. And I think that's what, and sometimes it's misconstrued today what C.S. Lewis might have meant, but he was talking about true myth. And he was talking about Christianity as a true myth. And sometimes that could seem offensive, don't compare Christianity to a myth. But what he meant by it was that myths are usually created to to satisfy people in their distress, to heal them, to give them some kind of hope for something. And then C.S. Lewis came to the conclusion, because C.S. Lewis had been an atheist, and as quite an older adult, a very educated man, probably educated than most ministers, he came to the Lord finally. A lot of it had the influence of Tolkien, his friendship with Tolkien. But C.S. Lewis was more famous for being a Christian and outspoken Christian. But he called it a truth myth because it was something that could give us hope, but this time it was true. Well, I'm looking at something I wrote 2 o'clock in the morning, so I just want to get myself clear. You have to indulge me in this too. The obvious thing at work is that, I'm a lot older than my contemporaries, so I work with people that weren't born yet or younger than my son. So much younger than my son. They weren't born when I was in the workforce, and even when maybe even when I started to come back to church, when I met my wife, 25. So some of them weren't even born yet when I started going back to church. And I feel isolated. I feel different than everybody. It's just like our church here. If you even look around in our small group, we're from so many different countries. We're from so many different walks of life. We're different ages. We've got different backgrounds. We speak different languages. And it was just like the sailors on Jonah's ship. That's what in Moby Dick they alluded to. He's on a ship. Everybody's different. Nobody's the same nationality. In the Shane story, you could say it's about redemption. Shane, the writer from nowhere, he seems to come from nowhere. And he meets this family, and they're homesteaders, and this is like in the context of the late 1890s. So I wasn't thinking about this way, but kind of be contemporaneous if this was a true story, but basically, it's based off of things that could be true. The Homesteader Act was still going on. The government was allotting land, and there was conflict between cattlemen and farmers. They started to take up too much land, and the ranchers wanted the range. And so things got violent. Shane comes from a time, and in the book and the movie is different. In the book, he's traditionally dressed in black. He's got the black hat, the black outfit. He's dressed real good. He described him being a slim, you get like the idea of an athletic, and the way he moves, you get the idea, like even from the 1940s, he's describing someone that might be like with martial arts. You get that kind of idea, like a kind of a Bruce Lee, very agile kind of guy. His face looks stern. You could tell that he's had experience in life. And then the boy in the movie, his name was Bob, but it's Joey in the movie. And he's the first one to meet Shane. And he's just in awe of him, and not fear, but awe. And Shane asks for a drink of water, and he brings him to the farm. And right away, the mother, Marion, and his father, Joe, they trust him right away. They have this trust. And you would think in these times, you just don't trust a stranger walking on your land, coming to your land like that out of nowhere, especially someone that's obviously a gunfighter. Because that was one thing in the genre, if you remember those Westerns, it's like it was black and white. If you wore a black hat, you're a bad guy. If you wore a white hat, you're a good guy. And we don't do that. We have to show the robes of righteousness. We have to wear the armor of God, and we have to show Jesus' character through us, no matter how we're dressed. It kind of culminates. Shane changes his clothes. He was just working on the farm, and he's wearing farmer clothes. So he has to go into town. And the cattlemen are young, tough guys. That's the real thing about the real West. There wasn't really that many cowboys. And gunplay happened, but it was a messy business. No one just got shot in the arm and kept going. You got shot, you're pretty much fatally wounded, and you would eventually die. And I think about the context of the story, that he's just a young man, and he's looking back. But he's an older man now, looking back on his past. It's being narrated through him. So a lot of years go by, and this is the way he remembers it as a kid. So a lot of things I'm saying now is maybe the way I remember it. But he's a much older man reflecting back. And so Shane's got the farmer clothes on. Now he represents a different character. The guys don't know, a young cowhand in there. He starts intimidating, because that's what they want to do. They want to intimidate these homesteaders and get them off the range, because they're going to make money with the cattle. And so he has to leave. He leaves because he's got the family. He's got to think of the family. So he's not going to show any bravado and fight. The family's more important to him. So he goes away. And so he's branded a coward. Even the homesteaders call him a coward. And the homesteaders this whole time are very timid, but now they're calling him a coward. Eventually, he has to confront the same young man again, and he beats him up terribly. But then he kind of goes over to him and he gives him medical aid. After he beats him up, he's brokenhearted about it, and he gives the young man medical aid. And it's very much like the Good Samaritan story, and I'm sure that was intended. The young man eventually has a change of heart, because it's usually like what we do for people and not what we say sometimes makes a difference. Pete will talk about this, and Kevin was talking about having the meeting for men. In the book, I got this. I lifted this from Spark Notes because I actually had read the book some years ago, and there's actually Cliff Notes. I didn't have time to get them, but I could find Spark Notes online, and I looked them over. Now, being some years since I read the story, but their idea of what it meant to be a man was to trust in others, and only a good person can trust another person. If you are not a good person, it's really hard for you to trust someone else. Fulfilling commitments, and we all know about that. Sometimes we fail. One of the points was never getting violent until it was absolutely necessary. So this is kind of and this is something you try to explain to young people. Maybe like in a storyline, this is kind of a common occurrence. But the westerns and dying novels of the early 1900s, pretty much written by people that were never there. To have your hero of the story not want to fight is how do you express that? How do you express certain things in the Bible in the context of the times? I grew up close by here, and it was a very small place, and there was very few houses. There's a lot of easement in between. Everything's different, of course, now. And the streets ended from one place to another. So you maybe had like a quarter of a mile or an eighth of a mile of a road, and it stopped abruptly. And then there was the Main Street 167th, but that didn't go all the way through to LaGrange Road like it does now. There was no mall. There was Tinley Park, Oak Park Avenue was you had to go that far. Now all those stores that were on Oak Park Avenue, like Jewel and everything, they moved to Harlem. But one side or the other was mud. I had a swamp on one side and mud on the other side. And every day, what I was supposed not to do was to get wet or muddy. And I was at least supposed to be home before it got. At dusk was the outer limit of how I could stay out. And I've always managed to come home late, which I didn't want to do because I was quite a coward and I didn't want to be in the dark. And but every day I would get muddy, and I get rebuked for that. But it happened every day. And in this town, and I like the way they did in the movie, it was one street, it had one row of houses, and everything's muddy. Because the one confrontation in the movie, it's kind of interesting what they did. They called the character Tory, and he's a rebel. And so everybody else is like a Yank, and he's a rebel. And this gunfighter comes to town, hired by the cattleman. And I'm trying to think who was played by in the movie. He had been a New York stage actor at that point, really young at the time. If it would enlighten you, but he was a very tall and imposing figure, very graceful and strong looking, and he was wearing all black in the movie. Shane was wearing buckskin when he came into the scene, but he was wearing the farmer clothes now, and the gunfighter's all in black, very intimidating. And the scene in the movie, the rebel, and his name's Tory, which actually means, like in England, like in the colonial times, you're a loyalist if you're a Tory. So I think it was just a kind of a play on words that his name's Tory, but he's a Southern rebel, and he's bitter, and he's trying to show bravado. He doesn't like to be put down. He doesn't like to be made fun of, and he's very angry. And the actor played him very well. And so he's tromping in the mud, and he wants to get in a saloon, but the gunfighter's not going to let him. And the gunfighter, so gracefully, he's just walking across the wooden sidewalk, so nice and easy, just kind of slowly putting on his glove because he knows what's going to happen, so nonchalantly. And he's just walking nice and smooth, and the other guy's tromping in the mud. And of course, he's not a gunfighter. And he keeps insulting the South and keep insulting him. And he's got such pride that he just has to do something against those odds. And he starts to draw, even kind of like gives up, and he gets shot. Now it's all legal in their eyes because it's kind of lawless. There's no law in the town. There's no law for like 100 miles. And then in stories, you like to identify with the hero. And I would like to identify with Shane. And like Bible stories, don't you like to identify with Jesus, I identify with this guy. He's like an angry coward, and I think that's often what I am, is an angry coward. And pride, you can see what happens. And it just kind of, I guess you get reflective, and I'm thinking like all the times, I remember finding out about mountain biking. People would actually ride their bikes in dirt. We were trying to find some kind of smooth path. We had plenty of dirt. We were trying to escape it. So I consider my town a Wild West. At this time, when I'm reflecting, I think I'm forgetting about any good times, and it just seemed kind of a lawless thing. Like I said, it was a small town, so most of the people that I had to play with and that were much older than me. And at those ages, when you're 7, 8, 9, and there's 10, 12, 14-year-olds, they're a lot bigger than you. And indulge me in a few anecdotes. But my dad wasn't one to say, if I came home and said, Dad, this guy beat me up, or this guy did this to me, he's not going to do nothing about it. And I kind of realized there's certain wisdom to that, because usually if adults get involved in things just perpetuate out of control, and a lot of times kids will resolve things or forget about it the next day. But he didn't know kind of what I was up against. And even when I say it, I know that we're all from different places and backgrounds. My childhood could have been like heaven compared to what a lot of people might have had to go through. But one day, this guy, very big, I remember his name, but I won't mention it. I like him to, when I was thinking about these things in Jonah, I'm liking him to the Assyrians. He's just heartless and cruel, and I can't even understand the cruelty at the time. If it wasn't expressed well on Room 22, I didn't know about it, but I now realize I think he was probably abusing drugs. But he just came up to me and started pushing me around, saying I said this and I said that, and I had no clue what was going on. And I remember trying to reason with him, but there was going to be no reason with him. I don't think you could reason with the Assyrians when they wanted to impale you. And of course, I was quite afraid. And my friends, what I consider my good friends, like brothers, they just stood aside. And I remember that only more so because I wasn't supposed to leave the neighborhood, the street. I had a little bit more freedom than a good friend of mine who was a very good Christian. I always called him John Christian Anderson, but I always consider him, now a bit of an innocent. He wasn't allowed to leave his yard at this time, and I used to visit him in his prison there, but spent a long time with him. We used to watch Captain America together on cartoons, but anytime I ever did anything bad, my dad was constantly there, just so ubiquitous. I thought, how in the world are you showing up? I'm doing this over here. How do you happen to just be there? And my brother, to this day, makes fun of me. One time, the whole family was in a car, and I had nowhere to go. I tried to hide behind a blade of grass, but he saw me. And it was my last-ditch effort. But my dad pulled up. My dad would never interfere in fights, but my dad saw what was going on. So my dad gets out of the car, and my dad is pretty much like my son's size, 5'9", 5'10", shorter than I am. And he might have been well in his 40s or early 50s at this time, but I'm thinking, to me, he's an old man, so I don't know where I am, but to me, I considered him old. And this guy is really big, and he's towering over him. And he's calling my dad little man. Come on, little man. He's threatening my dad. My dad just standing there, kind of walking forward. And I'm like, this is surreal to me, like I said, it was really out of the question for my dad to defend me in fights. He would just let me settle it on my own, which I didn't do. I got out of Dodge as quick as I could usually, but my dad just stood his ground. Actually, my dad progressed. He moved on him, and he kept backing up. This big, strong guy kept backing up. And then, my dad reminded me that, all of my friends that were with me, they didn't bother to help me. It's like, I guess I will say now, spoiler alert, but I guess you can't for a story, but you can count on Jesus. He will be with you. And I guess he was, because, my dad showed up just in the nick of time. I don't know what would have happened. I think this guy, I think my life was in jeopardy. I had several incidents like this. I probably forget most of them, but I had my brother Robert, and to me in the story, Robert is Shane. And also, you might find it a bit irreligious, but we're talking about the late 60s, early 70s, and my brother was a slim guy, kind of muscular, long hair. And I always remember, too, because like later on, in his later teens, he started with the beard and everything, so he was the stereotypical portrayal of Jesus in the movies. And he was like that to me, because he was like my second father. In the story of Shane, this boy had two role models. He had Shane, this slim, sophisticated gunfighter, and he had this big, burly, strong guy, earnest, honest guy, his dad. And they were both honest guys. They were both men. They both were loyal to each other. They both kept their commitments. They could count on each other. And I didn't have that in those friends of mine, who I considered like brothers. So I had the same deal. I was getting dusk because a gang of kids were taking my bike, and I loved my bike dearly. It was my favorite possession. I lived on my bicycle every day. And so I'm holding on for dear life, and I got 4 or 5 guys pulling it away from me. And then all of a sudden, in the distance, my brother's running up with his hair flowing in the wind, wearing a shirt with the cut-off sleeves. And I'm not sure, he must have been like 8th grade. But he had stopped his dad before then, because my dad, my dad had given me a crew cut and everything. We had short hair. My brother finally getting that freedom as he's getting older, and his plastic glasses were gone, and he just blue-eyed and long flowing hair, and these guys just scattered like cockroaches, So both times, neither my dad nor my brother had to fight. They just showed up. My son told me this not too long ago, and I really didn't know about it. And guess he was like me. He has a penchant, or he did. He's going to be 27, so he's kind of a little bit more off the frogs, but he has a scientific interest in all those things. But he doesn't spend time waiting in the mud as much as he used to. But like I said, there's all kinds of construction going on. We're living in the same area. He's in the same swamplands I used to play in. And he got stuck in the mud. And I had warned him about the swamp, because someone had lost their life there. You get in the water, you start wading in, everything seems fine, but you start sinking into the mud, and then you struggle. It's like quicksand, but quicksand it's a little bit of a myth, but this is real, because there's water and you're going under, and you're a kid, you're weak, and there's houses are distant. Actually, even now they're even more closer than they were. But so he's calling out for help, and no one's hearing him, and he's been there for a while, and it's summertime out. He hadn't drank or ate anything, and he's tired, he's wore out. In a distance, he sees someone, and he's trying to call out, and he can't reach that person. But suddenly, that person changes direction and starts coming right for him, and then that person pulls him out of the mud. And that was me. I never thought nothing about it. I happened to be working second shift. They just started it. They didn't run it too long. But where I was working before, they started running second shift, so I was home in the afternoon, and I wasn't in great shape at the time, but I decided I'm going to go for a run. And then I actually don't remember my thought process, because it took me a while to even remember, but yeah, it was just a random choice, as far as I knew, to run in that direction, and I saw him. Because it's a big place, a lot of weeds, a lot of fields. There's summertime, there's all kinds of noises going on, and he was getting weak at this time to even call out. And he told me that he was looking at the frogs, saying, this is going to be the last thing I see. Because the frogs, they were so elusive for him, and now all showing up and watching him. And, he recorded, he thought that was the last thing he was going to see. And then I mention these stories because when we talk about Jonah, and easily for me, I can segue thinking about Shane to Jonah and Zacchaeus. But when I had tried to do a children's story on Zacchaeus, and it just occurred to me, like the Jonah story, that I saw that Father and the Son were alike. I saw that personality of Jesus and God when God was with Jonah and Nineveh. At this point, I want you to indulge me on this, because I'm not the best reader in the world, and I want to go through Jonah in the Bible here. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed to Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for the port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed to Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God, and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish." Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us who's responsible for making all this trouble for us. What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you?" He answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." This terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" They knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, "What should we do to make the sea calm down for us?" "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied, "and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault for this great storm that has come upon you." Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not find, for even the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, "Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man. For you, Lord, we have done as you pleased." Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. I always liked that expression, belly of the beast. A couple of things I thought of when I read it was that, again, because we're all familiar with the story. But I almost can't call him a coward, in the sense that you would think. It's so easy, and I think that's why we have a tendency to whitewash things. Can you really put yourself in his place? Was it a combination of just fearing Nineveh, the cruelty? And Palin kind of predated crucifixion, but it was kind of rough. Vlad the Impaler did that. You impale someone with a pole, and you try to miss all the vital organs, and sometimes people were skilled at that, and this person would be suffering, and he would know that he's going to die, and it'd just be a matter of time. But if you impaled correctly, the guy who lived for a long time, you could miss organs, and it could be done. They had, they studied crucifixion, they studied these things too, and it could be done. So a person could last days. And like I said, how could someone be so cruel, especially as a culture? You get one aberration of a person, but a whole culture dedicated to cruelty. And that's why we kind of reflect on our own culture. How cruel can people be? He also just might have hated them because they were the kind of people they were. It's kind of likened, a lot of times that it's easy to liken it to maybe what's going on in the world now with, in that part of the world, with terrorism. Some people like it that you wouldn't go into certain neighborhoods. And I think that's all fair conjecture on this story. I was thinking about it, including it last, but yeah, it's amazing, this really short story, and I didn't quite finish it here, but it's just amazing the different takes people do sermons on, and just the little details they'll pick up on, or how they'll see it. And it's kind of a good thing to do, since it's a controllable little story. It's like the story of Zacchaeus, start and finish. And, you're not jumping around the Bible to make some kind of point. This is something that happened, and it happened in a certain way. And you can. It's like taking the whole Bible into context. We never have time to do the whole Bible in one sitting. But if you take the whole context, so you can't really go wrong. But yeah, people come up with all these different meanings into it, and I think it's all fair. Different walks of life. The man who made the movie, Shane, he was a director, and I said, a lot of these guys in this time, it'd be different later, but the director and a lot of the writers, they were in World War II. And this is where I have the affinity with Tony Guerra on this. I shouldn't mention anybody's names, but Tony G, we talked about a lot. this time period where you had It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart, or you had The Best Years of Our Life, which was a war movie, which always astounds me. It's late 40s. It has a certain kind of feeling to it. These guys had heart. I like it as an example that I had never, it probably was common knowledge to a lot of people. Way until I was adult, I didn't even know there was a Civil War camp in Chicago. And it was news to me that Southern prisoners were kept here. And at various times, they would have different commandants in charge of the camp. And they treated the prisoners really cruelly. The ones that were actually kind and started to change things around for the prisoners, to treat them with respect and dignity, were guys that were actually in the war. Guys that might have had friends or family killed in the war. These guys were kind. The guys that were cruel were desk jockeys. They never were in a war. They were just going there as like administrators. I left the story of Shane. I left Shane. He didn't have the confrontation with the gunfighter, and I won't finish that. And I left Jonah in the belly of the whale. We say whale. A lot of kids will argue with me. I even know the story, the Muslim version of it, and I know those kids, my friends, they argued that it's got to be a whale. And Pinocchio looked like he had a good time, but it couldn't have been pleasant. I will go one step further in the Jonah story in a moment, but I always like that phrase, the belly of the beast. It means a bad predicament. It obviously comes, from the story of Jonah, but you're just in a desperate situation, and that's the most dire straits, to be in the bottom of the ocean in a whale. And the one thing that reading this just, in the last few days that really occurred to me about the story is that, and it's reminiscent of, excuse me. I lost my train of thought, but Wally's an expert on this. Well, I'll just say the one thing that astounds me about the story, I'll feel foolish for not saying this later, but is that he's running away from God. He's running away from his divine mission, but he's just incredibly intimate with God. I mean, this is a story of a guy constantly intimate with God. I thought about, like, when I asked him where he was, he said, I'm a man of God, like I'm a Christian. Like sometimes I'm so ashamed of myself, I don't want to say, well, I'm a Christian. It's like sometimes when I try to give someone advice on health, they can kind of look at me and say, well, no, I'm good. It's like, am I reflecting Christ's character? Should I even just admit that I'm a Christian and defame him? But I never felt more like in the belly of the beast. I remember it was really hard times, and just really dark times. I had a car. I had no heat in the house. I had no heat in the car, and I had a long trip where our company had moved like 40 miles away, and I didn't have another job, and I stayed with it. And I wouldn't go to Tarshish. I would be afraid to go to Tarshish. I'm glad that at least Jonah had that kind of courage. So I think it's you can't whitewash and judge them in that kind of respect. Some people even think, like Jonah became a term, like, and there'll be sermons, avoid the Jonahs in your life. But I think that misses the whole point of the story about avoiding someone. But I just imagined, just feeling these dark things, and I can imagine how Zacchaeus, when he climbed that tree, how he was happy to see Jesus. And I think that's how I was, when I read this story, that was the feelings I had when I saw my brother and father show up and save me, and I'm sure that was the feeling Jeremy had when I showed up. But I had to drive all this miles in the wintertime in this cold, cold car, and I got bored with listening to the radio, and I hadn't been going to church in quite a while now. I was trying to run away, I guess, but I'm in the belly of the whale every day, so I didn't get very far. Maybe you couldn't see me. But a year or two earlier, that Mike Sadie had that evangelism series at our church, and so day after day, I listened to it, and it was like candy. For some reason, I think like any other series, it's never the same meaning for me. But just listen to Mike Sadie in his cold, cold car. And of course, I had to leave. I had to be there at 5:30 in the morning. So it's cold and dark in the morning. When I come home, it's cold and dark at night. And sometimes I'd have to stop at Kmart or something to walk around because my feet would be numb on my way home. But and 355 wasn't even through then. So I'm just taking these long drives, but just like, in the belly of the beast, you think you're so far away, but you're so close to God at that time. And sometimes you're better off left in the belly of the whale, aren't you, than being regurgitated. Because Jonah had a little slip up even after he was saved and his message was received. But what I'm trying to do is find Jonah's prayer in Jonah 2. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, "In my distress I called the Lord, and he answered me. From the deep realm of the dead I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me, the deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you, Lord, my God, brought me up from the pit. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But with shouts with grateful praise will sacrifice to you. And what I have vowed I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord God commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah into the dry land." You know, Kevin makes a point. I'm not blaming you for anything, Kevin, what I'm going to say, but or I had said. But you made a great point one time, and it was argued. You know, it's like you said that the blessing, you really got a blessing out of doing the sermon, and the retort was, well, you're not supposed to get the blessing, everyone else is. And I think like with if you even take a story of like Shane and the homesteaders, who is God redeeming, the homesteaders or Shane? I would say both. And Jonah, who was God saving? Was he saving the Ninevites, or was he really saving Jonah? You know, he's both. And I would pray that somehow that I got a blessing. I certainly got a blessing, and I would hope that would be both of us, all of us. You know, in this story, in our story, there is a happy ending. I think in Shane, it's unresolved. He leaves. In Jonah, you have that confrontation again at the end with God, and Jonah's still bitter. But overall, we know there's a happy ending to the story. You know, I always like, one of my themes is that I've had with you, just kind of like bouncing in the corridors back there for a long time, is God's providence. And another thing that some people might find irreverent, but I was just reading Tolkien. I was like 20 years old or 19. And I didn't know he was trying to make an analogy, but I caught, you know, so, oh, you know what? I understand, I think I kind of a little bit understand God's providence, God's whole big picture of what goes on, you know, that there's something more, there's a greater meaning that I could even understand. And really, I found out that he meant that. A lot of people say, well, you know, he's talking about wizards and stuff, but not really. You know, like Wizard of Oz, they're not really talking about witches or yellow brick roads. They're talking about other things, really. But Tolkien, you know, to even criticize him, even now I come to think of it almost as wicked, because what he was at the core of Tolkien was he was a Catholic, a different denomination, but he was a Christian. That was his fundamental thing. And as a Christian, he never put down any other religions or any other denominations. And he didn't proselytize in a sense, but he was always so open with his religion. It was a reason why C.S. Lewis became religious. And I think even C.S. Lewis came out of favor, but I mean, there was quite a revival in him, quite a revival in Nineveh. There was quite a revival because someone like C.S. Lewis, and maybe even those times, you know, a lot of people didn't understand Tolkien until later, this strong Catholicism. But he planted that seed in C.S. Lewis. And like I said, you know, it's kind of an amazing thing, because C.S. Lewis was quite an adult. He had his criticisms. He knew Hebrew. He knew languages. He might have been more knowledgeable than a lot of pastors, but he wasn't with God. And he finally, with eyes wide open, he became a Christian. And then, of course, in Jonah's story, that's Jesus. That's salvation. Jesus is there. He's the hero of the story. So I was going to look at other verses, but you may be glad. I don't know how long this went. I'll have to have my wife later tell me how long and maybe what I said. But about providence, I'll do a couple of verses before I end. But, and then some people say, well, God's control. And, definitely, you see that in Jonah. He's definitely in control of nature. But, almost seemingly manipulates Jonah. And I was thinking about that, and the verse came fast and ready. Hebrews chapter 12, try for verses 9 and 10. Try for the old King James Version here. Or the new King James Version, sorry. Furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? For they indeed for a few chastened us, as seemed best to them, but he for our profit, that we may be partakers in his holiness. I want a little bit more here, but I think it goes on here. I can't get this manipulated, but in crude language, it's like, but we're not. If he didn't care about us, we'd just be bastards, but he cares about us, and that's why he puts those divine appointments in our way, and sometimes we don't understand what's going on. We think, think it's punishment, but it's, as adults looking back at our childhood, we know that our parents just actually loved us all the more for being there. It's like Jonah, he's run away from God. He should be punished, but God's with him. God's with him. God is sovereign. And I'll say just the end of the story, we're going to look up 1 Corinthians 15, verse 14. I would like to read more of it. And if Christ has not risen, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is also in vain. And whatever you thought of me, or thought I said, or if I said something wrong or offensive or out of the realm of what anyone would, in their world view, I believe that Jesus, who he said he was, he's much more like, as you can identify in a story, you can identify with Paul. Paul was a very smart man, but he was a man, and he came to believe Christ was our salvation, and he was kind of more than a C.S. Lewis. So I think that we just end on that note that the Lord is salvation, and that's what all the stories are all about. That's what the whole Bible is about. Thank you. Amen.